Ladies and gentlemen, I am Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran, and today is July 26th, 2022, and this is your daily Ukraine update. And while the front hasn't shown a lot of activity, boy, there's been some interesting developments on the propaganda front. Let's get into it. So, first and foremost, as discussed, the Russians continue to make a bizarrely small amount of gains compared to the big pushes they were able to do to seize places like Lysychansk. As we see here, in the past 2 days, the Russians have made very incremental progress towards seizing the power plant in the north of the Volostyrsk reservoir, and as we've discussed, any sort of advance that the US or the Russian forces are going to do is predicated on them being able to get a unified front across this area as they push towards Bakhmut. They've also made some progress, tiny advances. Again, as always, I caution us to, in these sort of maps, when it comes to tiny little changes on the map, be skeptical. The battlefield is always changing, and usually these tiny adjustments reflects realities that came to pass days ago, but we only now have identified. When we look to the north, we see progress by Russian forces is even slower. It's a tiny, small, it's not even a village. It looks like maybe a stream or something that they've seized, a little reservoir. Again, an area that was already listed as contested. So Russians are indeed continuing to make forward progress, but in key areas, again, this small gap here in Hirovka still remains open. We talked a lot about the need to push, the need of the Russians to push beyond Bohorodichne, and you can see that for days and days and days, the Russians haven't really gone anywhere. So all in all, this may be a sign that Russian forces are indeed reaching the limits of their equipment and personnel. We've talked about this before, that of course on both sides, every lost soldier is going to be replaced by someone who is a little less qualified, a little less trained, and definitely less experienced. And so over time, those effects can compound. You also see those effects in equipment. That's one of the reasons that NATO and Western countries have been supplying Ukraine with fresh equipment continuously, because if Russia is unable to backfill damaged or worn out equipment, it's going to become much, much slower. And there's been some reports that that is the case. Institute for the Study of War has actually reported, let's see if we can find the animation up here. This is actually NASA's fire heat anomaly tracker, which is a pretty good proxy because our heavy artillery fire has a tendency to start small fires. And you can see early, as time ticks on this map, you realize that Russian artillery has just become way less active. And some people think that it is due to US HIMARS systems attacking Russian munitions and logistics depots. I think that's definitely a contributor. But I also sort of suspect that the Russians may not be able to dig up functioning artillery pieces. The Soviets were famous for mass producing equipment, but producing equipment of pretty low quality, meaning that the wear and tear, the rate at which these sometimes 70-plus-year-old pieces of equipment wear out can be very, very rapid. And given the Russian reliance on artillery, I wouldn't be surprised at all if some of this wasn't even the handful of HIMARS systems hitting high-value targets, but was just as much the Russians just plain old running out of guns. There's also, of course, some discussion that about the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kherson, which we've talked about weeks ago, but it's under intelligence embargo, and so there's very little publicly available information about those operations. But the fact that Ukrainian President Zelensky and the Ukrainian defense ministry has begun to talk about it as progressing means that there's probably at least some reasons for optimism. But what I think is the most interesting news, for better or worse, is the Ukraine government has their National Security and Defense Council has a Center for Countering Disinformation, and they've put out a list of individuals who, it says you're promoting Russian propaganda. The actual website translates it as countering or aligning with Russian talking points. So it doesn't necessarily, at least from that translation, accuse these people of being Russian agents, as some of the press has reported. It just says that they are repeating Russian talking points, and this is pretty common when you look at Russian disinformation or disinformation of any kind, is that oftentimes these the best disinformation is when it's not paid it's when they're not paid shills for something, when they naturally come to a conclusion that aligns with yours. This would be like oil companies finding scientists whose research already says climate change isn't real and amplifying their message. They don't need to be paid by oil companies because statistically, if you have enough people, there's going to be a couple of crackpots that believe some nonsense. So this is Ukraine's list of crackpots, but what's interesting is there are more than a couple of Americans on there. It includes, of course, journalist Glenn Greenwald, someone who, this is not his first connection to pro-Russian intrigues, but notably his former House Representative and Army Reserve Lieutenant Colonel Tulsi Gabbard, who, of course, is no stranger to pro-Russian talking points, but, she claims, of course, that she has condemned this, condemned Russia's invasion in the strongest terms, and no one could be less pro-Russian than her. But what I just going to point out, and I'm going to see if I can do this without getting demonetized, if you Google Tulsi Gabbard, Ukraine tweets, you will see some controversial statements. In this one, she criticizes, quote, warmongers that argue that we must protect Ukraine because it's a democracy, but they're lying. Ukraine isn't really a democracy. Ukraine's president shut down 3 TV stations that criticized him, etc. Not sure why we need to, one, the standard for a democracy is not perfection. Otherwise, the U.S. has a lot of issues of its own. But this is, again, a pretty standard pro-Russian talking point that Ukraine is actually an autocratic state and that Russia is liberating it. Let's see. Of course, military.com has an extensive article documenting her repeated Ukrainian disinformation peddling, and an embarrassing statement by the 1st Special Forces Command, recognizing that they really, really don't represent, her statements don't represent 1st Special Forces Command. She also met Bashir al-Assad in 2017, who is, of course, a Russian-backed dictator in Syria. Right, she said, of course, Ukraine isn't actually a democracy. Let's see. And there was another good one in here. That Putin's buildup of troops near Ukraine was justified because the country was pursuing NATO membership. This is, of course, another talking point that aligns almost perfectly with Russian propaganda. Here's the tweet. And the reason it does is because Ukraine was not on pace to join NATO. For years, they had tried to thread the needle where Ukraine was not a NATO member expressly because of Russia's security concerns. There was a lot of NATO assistance, a lot of NATO training, but the truth is there weren't really any sign that NATO membership was anywhere on the horizon for Ukraine. So this idea that somehow Ukraine was imminently becoming a NATO member and that Russia had no choice but to invade is a Russian talking point. Here's another one. This one's pretty eye-watering, where she repeats the Russian, just straight outright lie that there were biolabs in Ukraine. I guess we reached back into the that pandemic playbook and dusted off an old conspiracy theory from that. Yeah, biolabs. Okay, cool. I mean, I guess I don't even know what to make of this. Researching dangerous pathogens. I'm gonna get demonetized if I repeat this. The point is, yeah, here's another one where she says Ukraine isn't a real democracy. The point is that, you know, there's at least a credible case to be made that at least in this one instance, this person is indeed parroting some Russian talking points. And I'm sure if you look in my comments at the trolls, you'll see plenty of Russian talking points being parroted too. As always, guys, thanks for joining me. Of course, if you want to see the combat video breakdowns that are just too spicy for YouTube, you want to become a member of the Patreon. Link is in the description. I'm on the road, so I can't show you guys my full Patreons. Oh, wait, yes, I can. Boom. Thank you to my Lieutenant tier patrons. I'll catch you guys in the next one.